Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us at this webinar on municipal finance. We will begin this webinar with a short introduction by a representative of Ecuador's Ministry of Urban Development and Housing. Then we will proceed to the seminar on municipal finance given by Drs. Vito Intini and Dimitri Pozidaev. After that, we will have a short one-question survey and we will proceed with the Q&A section. You can ask your questions throughout the seminar in the chat window. We will answer them at the end. Now I introduce to you Ms. Maria Cristina Gomez Jurado from the Habitat and Human Settlement Secretary of Ecuador's Ministry of Urban Development and Housing.
Good evening, everybody. I'm the representative of the Ministry of Urban Development and Housing of Ecuador. The Ministry of Urban Development and Housing has been working for the last years in the development of national urban policies that will change the urban development model that has created unsustainable cities and has fostered inequality in all over our country. In this context, it is important events such as Habitat 3 that provide us with a unique chance to fuel the discussion over the kind of cities that we want and what we will have to do to build them. We are committed to principles such as the right to the city, the social function of property, and to the idea that living well in the city should be for all and not for those who can afford it. All of these principles are included in our Constitution and laws. However, it's not enough just to have them written down if we don't have the means or the strategies to implement them. We believe that in a country where more than 70% of the people live in cities, we can no longer delay a national debate on these issues. We have found that hosting these important international meetings, such as Habitat 3, has awakened the interest in city planning and management in universities, with architects, engineers, stakeholders, and the community in general. And this is a chance we want to take full advantage of. Making cities better will take an enormous amount of effort, and one of the biggest challenges we face as a country is that the fastest growing cities are the small and intermediate ones, precisely the cities that lack human and financial resources, and that will make good city planning and management possible. In this context, the ministry is working very hard to provide these cities with enough means to face the problems of fast urbanization, especially with national legal frameworks and training programs that will strengthen their capacities. We believe that making cities better is a collective effort, so we are pleased to present this cycle of webinars which make part of a bigger context of national and urban debate that we hope that will help us as a country in the construction of a national urban agenda for more equitable, inclusive, and prosperous cities for all. For this fourth webinar event, I present you Dr. Vito Intini, who is manager of the Municipal Investment Fund program at the UN Capital Development Fund. Dr. Intini has extensive experience in the area of regional economics, private and financial sector development, poverty reduction, and public financial management. He has served in academia and various international organizations such as the European Union, Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, Organization for Economic Cooperation Development, the World Bank, and the UN Secretariat. Dr. Intini holds a master's degree in environmental policy, development economics, and a PhD in economic geography. Thank you very much.
Hello. Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me? Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes, Dr. Intini, we can hear you.
Okay, so I will start my presentation. Good morning, everybody. It's really a pleasure to have this presentation and to share some of the thoughts that we basically put together over our experience in local development finance and municipal finance over the last few years. I recently joined to UNCDF, so I will also make reference to some of the UNCDF experience in this field. The presentation will start with my presentation. There will be two parts. The first part is my presentation, which will give you overall introduction to key local finance issues and aspects and lessons learned. And then there would be a second part that would be presented by a colleague of mine, Dmitry Pozdiaev, who will analyze a bit more in depth new aspects of municipal finance that are related to public-private partnership and project financing. So I will start with my part, and then I will pass the floor to Dimitri. So as you can see, the structure of the presentation, my presentation, is the following. I will give a general overall introduction, and then I will dwell a bit on key aspects of municipal and local finance. Then I will touch upon intergovernmental fiscal transfers and performance-based grants that have been developed over the last 20 years. And then I will also analyze a bit the land value capture, which has a big potential in terms of revenue collection at the local level. And then also I will explain a bit the importance of credit rating in order to have access to innovative financial instruments and further applications. And then a few thoughts on the new urban agenda that is under discussion right now that will lead to Quito in October. And then I will give you some of the readings, many of which you already have, I guess, in your folder. So I will start with the global key trends. In terms of urbanization, we all know that more than half of the world now is urbanized. In the next 35 years, 2.5 billion people are expected to increase the urban population, most of which would be in Africa and South Asia. When it comes to the Latin America region, already more than 80% of the population is urbanized. And around a quarter of this population is estimated to live in informal settlement. Now, why urbanization is such a powerful and a structural trend over human history is for simple economic rules and principles. Proximity and density trigger higher productivity and are an engine of innovation. That's throughout the world. In terms of some key indicators, development indicators, we can see in the lower bottom of the slide that in terms of access to electricity, access to sanitation, the Latin American region is performing relatively better than other regions over time. Access to water in urban areas is a bit more mixed picture in terms of different regions and trends as well. But when it comes to internet users and mobile subscription, the trends are way more clear. And this has an impact in terms of what I'm going to say later on. In terms of overall quality of infrastructure, because infrastructure can be measured in terms of access, but also in terms of quality of service provided by this infrastructure, the picture is a bit more mixed. And the Latin American region doesn't perform as well as in terms of access, for instance, and is at par with other regions, more or less. And there is a clear difference between OECD countries and the rest of the other regions. In terms of global financial trends that have an impact eventually at the local level, we can say that official development assistance to developing countries has been stabilized around $130 billion, 1/3 of which goes to LDCs. But this is a very minor share, and it's a bit of a drop in the ocean because the financing gap in terms of infrastructure in particular is estimated to be around $2.5 trillion US. On the other side, when it comes to different types of assets, banking assets, institutional investors, bond market and equity market, the figures are way bigger. That means that there is a big set of assets that is particularly coming from the private sector that has a potential to be tapped into in order to fund some of these infrastructure projects, also at the local level. New regulatory requirements coming from Basel III and Solvency II also provided this incentive for long-term investment in the banking sector because of the liquidity requirements. At the same time, foreign direct investment in developing countries has now passed foreign direct investment in developed countries. And this is also a huge potential that could be tapped into. While providing this background, we should also be aware that new modalities of doing investment are coming up and raising. For instance, 2,200 financial institutions have signed Principles for Responsible Investment. And some of these principles could be applied to developing countries for climate adaptation resilience investment projects in developing countries, for instance. In recent surveys, 6 out of 10 investors in the US take into consideration social environmental implications when they decide how to invest. And in the very recent few years, in just 4 or 5 years, the main Standard & Poor's 500 listed companies issued corporate social responsibilities reports. In the bottom of the slide, you can see the trends, the huge increase in green bonds issued, and now we are over $70 billion around the world, and also investment funds that use environmental, social, and governance criteria that are that have a developmental impact. But importance of local finance has become increasingly at the center stage, as we can see also in the global debate. There has been increasing reference in a number of agreements and documents, like the Addis Ababa Agenda for Action, the Paris Declaration, the recent SDG debate, and then Habitat 1, 2, and 3, which is the Habitat 3 is currently ongoing. Now, when it comes to Latin America, some of the key aspects in terms of investment requirements are that an additional, infrastructure investment financing will need to double in order to meet the increasing economic and demographic trends in the region. That means that around $100 billion annually extra amount is needed. And the way it is right now is that the majority of investment funding comes from the public sector. Now, some of the global trends you can see in the following part, in the second part of the slide, also involve the Latin American region. You know the region better than me, so you can see which ones of these trends really match the region. I would assume that many of those also are related to the region, like the rise of sovereign wealth funds, private investment funds, the increase in listed companies, the importance of remittance for new financial instruments like diaspora bonds, and asset-backed securities over the last few years in terms of trends. So when it comes to sources of local capital finance, we can see how they distribute according to 2 main axes and 2 main criteria. One criteria which you find on the x-axis is about the wealth of local communities, and the other that you can find on the y-axis is about the social purpose of the particular investment project, or if it has a more kind of revenue generating capacity that will attract private investors. So based on these 2 axes, you can see that when a local community is poor and the investment aims to provide a public goods, so for a social purpose scope, then grants is typically the main source of funding around the world. But then if in the same poor community we want to invest in potential revenue generating kind of infrastructure, then you can go for a blended capacity, a blended financial structure, which includes also grants, loans and grants, or just reimbursable grants, or matching funds to those loans or grants. But when the community itself becomes richer, then you have a pool, a wealth of different financial instruments that can be used. That is not only loans and grants, but then also involves bonds and equity. So this is what we are doing at UNCDF through the program that we manage, I manage, where basically we look at the potential of financial contributions coming from the global level, from the national level, and the local level, put them together in either structured kind of vehicles or together funding local economic space and fixed capital formation from different sources and through different instruments. So what are the key aspects that we should bear in mind? Well, one of the key aspects that we can see throughout the world in all developing countries is the mismatch between revenues and spending. You can see in the first graph that countries tend to spend more at the local level than the revenues they receive. And in the table below, particularly highlighting the Latin American region, you can see that revenues as a percentage of total revenues, local revenues, are just about 4%, whereas local expenditure as a percentage of total expenditure is over 11%. So there is a factor of almost 3 to 1. And this is true throughout the other regions in the world. When it comes to local financial management, that's the backbone of any introduction to local finance that we should start from. You can see that the public financial management at local level is made of 4 critical aspects: the budgeting process, the accounting system, financial reporting mechanism, and auditing. These 4 are the critical elements that make together a sound and viable local financial management system. Now, a lot of these aspects are still under a kind of development process in many cities, municipalities, local governments around the world. There is a mix of capacities in the same country, not just between countries. When it comes to revenues and expenditure of a typical municipal budget, you can divide those in current revenues and capital revenues, and expenditure as well in current expenditure and capital expenditure. You can see how the breakdown works in terms of current revenues and expenditure that make up the current budget, and the capital revenues and capital expenditure that make up the capital budget. In terms of revenues, so we start looking at now each single aspect of what we have seen so far. In terms of revenues and financial resource, you can see that the main source of financial resource are intergovernmental transfers. The numbers you see next to the heading, to the title, means the ranking. So of course, it varies a lot across countries around the world because each country has its own specificity. But overall, in terms of aggregate average, we can say that intergovernmental transfers are important, very much important, I would say, and together with taxes. Taxes are income, sales, or business taxes usually, and those are as important. Then, following those 2, we have user charges. In many local governments around the world, those are actually very important. In others, like in many African countries, they do not make up a big share of overall local revenues. Property tax is as important, is more important in industrialized countries. In developing countries, the average is still 1/4 compared to OECD countries, so it's around 0.5%. Based on what I've seen in a lot of Latin American countries, there is no much difference compared to the average I've seen globally. Land value capture, sales, and leases are come next in terms of importance. But again, in some of Latin American local governments, cities, those are even more important. And then fee, permits, and license come more or less together with the land value capture. I have to say that these two have a huge potential, is very often untapped potential in terms of generating revenues that would benefit local governments. And the last source of revenue is typically in terms of fines or penalties. Now, when it comes to external sources, as I told you, official development assistance, so international cooperation, is one of the sources, but it's quite volatile. The same local government, the same city might have quite a relatively big injection one year and might not have anything else in terms of ODA in the following years. So it's difficult to rely on these kind of sources. Of course, then there are debt instruments, as we will see later on, and this is one of the instruments, the group of instruments where a lot of Latin American cities are ahead of compared to other countries around the world, and equity is also a potential external source that my colleague Vladimir will dwell on later on. Property taxes can be calculated in many different ways. There are different modalities: area-based assessment, value-based assessment, rental value, flat tax. The main difference is in terms of area-based assessment is basically measuring the surface of that property and basically attach a multiplier to that. The value-based assessment it can be the result of different indicators, criteria in terms of, for instance, position between in the city center or in the periphery, types of the manufacture, and so on and so forth. Rental value is in terms of a market-based assessment of the potential rent that can be generated. Now, in terms of property tax, that again has a huge potential, untapped potential. There are many lessons learned around the world. Digital cadastre is an important policy reform that has showed a lot of results. Street addressing is critical as well, and also the connection of the cadastre to the fiscal authority. In terms of user charges, as I told you, has another untapped potential. There are different ways of calculating, charging beneficiaries, users. Typically, the marginal cost calculation that also can be calculated throughout the same day, like peak hours, for instance, increasing the charge during peak hours, or average cost methodology. Or in terms of, and this has a more social implications, progressive block charges that are progressives based on the income level of a household. That's more complicated to apply, particularly in developing countries where fiscal records might not be complete and up to date. In terms of reforms, there are many types of reform. Metering in terms of some of the utilities, an up-to-date database, again, street addressing, or cross-billing, so basically billing other services, put on other service bill the service that has not been, that is intended to be charged. And then there are also customers care relationship like help desk, appeal system, and of course, better communication and overall improvement of service. That's yeah, a bit of the chicken and the egg. Sometimes charges are increased without improving the service itself, and that's something that you know, encounters the resistance of public opinion and beneficiaries. Just to show you an example in terms of property tax, that's the experience that we have seen over the last decade or even more in terms of property tax reform done in the municipality of Bogota. You can see in the continuous red line how the overall value of land, registered land in the cadastral system records has increased drastically over the last few years compared to the business as usual scenario. So what are the characteristics of a good tax base? Well, a good tax base, if it's possible, should be not mobile, in the sense that the taxable base should be on the local government, on the municipality, on the territory, because if cannot capture that component, it's difficult to charge based on the service provided in that specific municipality. Needs to be stable and predictable, ensure accountability, so needs to be very clear to the public, so that the public know very well what they are paying for. Needs to be perceived as fair, as I already referred to in some of the examples. Easy to administer, obviously, because the red tape hides itself behind a very difficult administrative structure and procedures. So easy to administer is critically important. And also, particularly in terms of charges, they need to be financed by the beneficiaries, users, while preserving fairness, so while preserving social equity. The expenditure management cycle here is pretty clear. You can see on the left-hand side, local governments usually start with developing plans, expenditure plans, then allocate resource according to those plans, and then after that they need to implement plan and control expenditures, and then monitor and account how those expenditures took place, and then audit the overall expenditure plan that has been implemented, and a review. Critical to this expenditure management cycle is the procurement cycle. The procurement cycle that you can see on the right-hand side has critical steps, like the publication of expression of interest, the short listing of offers, and then the negotiation with the prospective bidder. Of course, in terms of time frame can vary a lot. It depends on the complexity of the procurement document and service and good to be procured. But those two are critical aspects of a sustainable expenditure management system. Together with public financial diagnostics like a subnational PEFA. PEFA stands for Public Expenditure and Financial Accountability. So the PEFA Secretariat has developed a methodology with underlying indicators that look at the strategy, the efficiency, and discipline of local government spending. And also, in terms of monitoring evaluation methods, there are a number of methods. One method is variance analysis, to see how expenditure vary in the same group of expenditure, the same categories, how they vary over time or among different municipalities and territories. Service delivery benchmarking, that's basically using other local governments that are deemed to be more efficient in terms of benchmarking, how much it costs to spend in certain goods or services. Of course, ISO certification is of help in this respect, and a citizen surveys, including public expenditure tracking surveys. In terms of accounting practice, there are four possible options, and again, you find on the x-axis the way to manage entry booking, and then, of course, there is a single entry, double entry booking, and also in terms of modality of accounting, which is typically either cash-based or accrual-based accounting. And of course, a lot of developing countries start with the cash-based accounting and single entry, but eventually they move towards the double entry and accrual-based accounting over time. This is not an easy process because it entails an overall reform in the public financial management system. It takes a lot of time, but eventually a lot of municipalities, the local governments manage to get there. In terms of asset management, first of all, we should define what we mean by assets. Assets are typically divided in tangible and intangible assets. Tangible are physical assets, basically. Intangible assets are money, equity, bonds, options that municipalities might own. What is important for a sound asset management system is a sound policy framework and inventory of these assets, evaluation of the assets, and that's very critical. Book value, market value, yield potential are different methods to evaluate these assets. And of course, public reporting as well is critical. So assets quite sometimes entail liabilities. And here liabilities are of different nature, and this is very important to bear in mind. There can be debt kind of liability, guarantees, pension obligations towards staff of either local governments or municipal companies, PPP and potential liabilities related to public-private partnership, but also liabilities related to, for instance, land reclamation for contaminated sites in terms of brownfield investments. The other critical step in this asset management is, for local government, is to come up with a sound long-term capital investment plan. This the capital investment plan is basically a method, a way to prioritize investment, infrastructure investment in the medium and long term. A lot of local governments do not do it, or they do it once in a while, but not on a continuous basis. Or when they do it, they don't influence the budget cycle later down the road. And that's a critical aspect that needs to be borne in mind. After that, of course, okay, I understood the message that I need to speed up. So in any case, what is important to bear in mind here is that there are different methods to evaluate capital investment projects in terms of future capital investment projects and in terms of current capital assets that you can see here. Some key performance indicators that local governments should bear in mind using some benchmark ceilings you can see on the right-hand side. In terms of budget deficit, wage and salary expenditure, capital investment, operating expenditure per capita, and so on and so forth. These are some guiding tools that can help local government staff, municipal staff, to compare themselves with some benchmarks in other countries or in other cities in the same country. In terms of access to international funds, for instance, in terms of urban projects funding through ODA, you can see here the background. There is a breakdown between least developed countries and lower middle income and upper middle income countries. There is quite a fair distribution of those. There has been a late increase in this funding, but still it's not sufficient to fund. Now, I will speed up and move to the intergovernmental fiscal transfers. This is just an example of how this transfer from the central government to the local government can vary a lot based on countries. In some countries, it's very critical and reach even more than 90% of overall revenues at the local level. In some others, it's very minimal. These transfers have different purposes. Some of the objectives are, of course, to close the fiscal gap, compensation for new tasks that are provided, transfer from the central level to the local level, objective of equalization between different territories in the same country, to set up priorities from the central government to the local government, promote better performance in some critical areas, stabilization, and also political too. The grants can be conditional or unconditional. There are advantages and disadvantages. Unconditional basically leaves the local government to use the way they prefer based on their development needs. Conditional basically exercise a kind of influence from the central level to the local government in terms of areas, key areas to be used. A critical component of these intergovernmental transfers are performance-based grants. The performance-based grants have been developed over the last 20 years or so. Basically improves over time the absorption capacity of local governments in terms of transfer from the central level to the local level, improves the needs assessment at the local level done in order to improve their systems in place in terms of public financial management and expenditure capacity. And also improves the accountability in terms of upward and downward accountability. Here are some, you can see on the right-hand side, some example of indicators that are commonly used in performance-based grants. The indicators can be related to the planning aspect, to the budgeting aspect, to the expenditure management aspect, to revenue reporting or oversight aspect of the public financial management system. And here you can see some of them. The experience has been expanding in performance-based grants. We have been directly or indirectly involved in many least developed countries. Some of them are listed in this slide. When it comes to land value capture, as I was saying, this has a huge potential because it will help basically tackle some of the aspects that are structurally underlying many developing countries in terms of population and economic growth. Some critical aspects, land-based finance methods are betterment levies, and Bogota is an experience in this field, impact fees, and Santiago has shown some experience in this, lease and sale of municipal land, sale of development rights, like in this case, Sao Paulo CEPAC bonds. Here you can see the description of each one of these instruments, some key requirements and difficulties. Developer extraction, which is basically the obligation of developer of who builds on a site to build also an infrastructure associated to the site is quite straightforward, but sometimes the regulations are not that clear. And you can see the other modalities and the pros and cons. Most of them, or if not all of them, require a lot of capacity at the local government level in terms of projection, in terms of assessment of the fee or the levy that needs to be adopted, and also in terms of clarity of the legal framework. Now, in terms of credit rating, I will rush on this part. Some critical aspects that are considered in the rating assessment of a local government are the local economy together with the national one, local demography, debt and fiscal situation of that specific local government, the financial situation, the managerial capacity of the municipality, and the clarity and comprehensiveness of the legal framework. There are a lot of benefits associated with local rating. The main one, besides improving their internal management and budget systems in place, it also provide expand the pool of potential investors in a specific municipality. So not only giving a signal to local financial institutions like local banks, but also to nationwide institutions or even foreign investors. Here are some rating methods and data. You can see on the left hand side at the bottom one of the main credit rating agencies weighting these different aspects in order to come up with a final rating. And you can see that there is a breakdown at the regional level between number of rated local governments, but those data are a bit old, needs an update based on the recent trends after the financial crisis. Now, in terms of further applications, and I'm almost done, of course, here you can see four main areas where financial instruments have been developing over the last 20 years or so, in the two critical areas of public sector and private sector. The main financial instruments aim to be a financing instrument per se, or risk management instruments. And over the 20 years, you can see an increasing bridging of the gap between the public sector and private sector. Because of this, innovative instruments have basically been used in both sectors in some way or another. One of these is municipal bonds. You can see here how the bonds work, the whole cycle on the right hand side, and also on the bottom, on the left hand side, you can see that in terms of investors, there can be public sector or private sector investors. Here is the overall process in terms of issuing municipal bonds, which start with a financial management assessment and the credit rating of a specific local government. Then a financial structuring, basically deciding who is going to issue the bond itself and what kind of modalities. And then there is a preparation of legal documents together under the provision of a lot of support in terms of transaction advisors, legal advisors, financial advisors that can help them, the local government, to come up with a successful issue of a bond. Of course, there are differences in terms of bonds modalities. There are general obligation bonds, like those issued in Johannesburg, revenue bonds in India, structural bonds that have been issued in Argentina, bullet bonds. Here you can see the difference between pros and cons between bonds and bank lending. There are pros in terms of long-term horizon that the bonds try to tackle, whereas bank lending are easier to be issued. Here you can see the structure between general obligation bonds and revenue bonds. General obligation bonds basically rely on the overall revenues from the municipalities, whereas revenue bonds tackle specifically either a specific project, infrastructure, or investment that can generate revenues. In terms of debt servicing, there are different ways to service the debt at the local level. Those are the three main ways that you might see. Levered debt service, where basically the principal is increasingly provided paid back, whereas level principal is a principal that is constant over time in terms of payback, or bullet debt, where the principal is paid back at the very end of the bond. Close to the bond is a securitization process. Here you can see different securitization modalities. I will not dwell much into that because my colleague Dimitri is going to talk about it. But there are basically two types of securitization: future flows and existing assets, which means asset-based asset-based backed securities that have a similar logic, but based on future projection of the value of a certain asset and existing projection. Here are some security facilities. This is one that is done at the global level based on a climate change adaptation facility that is called Green Climate Partnership Facility, where you have different investors investing in either junior tranche, mezzanine tranche, or senior tranche that will go then into the investment portfolio managed by an investment manager and then selected for sustainable projects that can be done at the local level. Another way to do to have access to innovative financial instruments is municipal pool financing. Both developed and developing countries do that for different reasons that you can see here, but those are two promising ways, even though the experience is a bit mixed, but is a way to tap into economies of scales of small municipalities. Other modalities include crowdfunding, and here you can see some examples, and diaspora bonds. Diaspora bonds have been used in a few cases, but are increasingly used also to fund infrastructure projects. Just to finish, basically a few thoughts on the new urban agenda and on the draft that is under discussion right now. Basically, just to flag that the draft is quite comprehensive, but it needs to be tightened up and streamlined in the two main parts. And it's not clear to me if it looks more a strategy than a real implementation plan, and this is something that is under discussion now. Maybe aspects related to transparency, corruption could be emphasized a bit more. The role of cities in attracting foreign direct investment or remittances needs to be emphasized, and also the management of city assets, not only land, could be a central role, together with addressing special needs of small cities that have a kind of disproportional financial needs, and also the coordination mechanism for the follow-up of that agenda. Here are some further readings that you can have access to, and at the bottom you can see some of our projects, including the Municipal Investment Finance project that I manage. Now I will pass the floor to my colleague Dimitri, and thank you very much for your attention.
Hello, Dr. Pozidaev. Please, if you could begin with your presentation.
Yes,
for 10 minutes.
Yes, absolutely. I will try to do it in 10 minutes. Good morning or good evening, colleagues, wherever you are, and this is a pleasure to be with you, and many thanks to my colleague Vito for giving this Municipal Finance 101 introduction. We will now become a bit more specific, and we will go into the modalities of trying to tap into market-based capital for long-term infrastructure financing. As you can see, the two big issues that we are going to discuss today are related to project finance and public-private partnerships. And so our discussion is really focused on these two issues. One is project finance, and the other one is public-private partnerships. Before we go into specifics, we have to start with a bit of theory, and I apologize for this. You have heard enough theory today, but we do need to talk a little bit about project finance. And probably the best way to discuss project finance is to discuss it in the context of corporate finance, how it is different from corporate finance. And you can see several factors here in the first column. But the major thing is that in the case of corporate finance, whatever you finance against your balance sheet. If your annual profit, if you put it this way, is, for example, $10 million, then you borrow again $10 million. In the case of project finance, you borrow against the project that you are trying to finance. And if that project is supposed to produce $100 million in revenues, then you borrow against $100 million, not against $10 million that you have on your balance sheet. And this is the principal difference between these two approaches. Well, and as you understand, there is no such thing as a free lunch. So if you are trying to use project finance, you have to have a type of project that meets the requirements for project finance. And again, there are several characteristics, but the most important one is that those projects need to be revenue generating. They need to produce a steady cash flow pattern that can be essentially used as collateral for the finance that you are attracting, whether this finance comes in the form of equity or in the form of debt. Most usually, it does come in the form of debt. So to be able to demonstrate to the debt provider that you are in a position to service your debt, you need to demonstrate that that project provides a steady stream of cash flows. And this is the key feature of project finance. And when it comes to the types of projects that you can finance, you can imagine that these could be electric power generation projects, these can be telecom and transport related projects, these can be markets and commercial facilities where you charge fees for the use of those facilities, as well as agricultural and food processing facilities, warehouses, and so on and so forth. When we are talking about the revenue generating nature of the projects, it might be the case, and it does happen quite often in the context of the public sector, that the projects cannot produce enough revenues without some additional support. In this case, there may be the so-called output-based support that comes as part of the revenues of that project, even though the project by itself cannot produce enough revenues because, for example, it plays an important social function. Now, let us move to the issue of joint ventures as an alternative to municipal debt, or as a supplementary approach to municipal debt. Now, when we are talking about public-private partnerships, we need to demystify this concept because it comes in many shapes. But essentially, you have three types or three degrees of engaging with the private sector, depending on how structured and formalized that relationship is. The most structured and formalized relationship is a joint venture company. It is also known as a special purpose vehicle, an SPV, in the context of project finance, the topic that we've just discussed. This is a separate company with its own legal personality, with its own assets, and bearing full responsibility for the success, or as the case might be, failure of the project. Now, with the partnership arrangements, this is a less structured form of cooperation between the public and private sector. And in this case, each party can borrow against its balance sheet, not against the project as such, but against its balance sheet, and or provide equity or quasi-equity. And if one of the partners, like the private entity, establishes a project company, an SPV, special purpose vehicle, then it can borrow against the future project revenues. And eventually, the least structured form of cooperation is a contractual consortium, which is an agreement essentially on cooperation between public and private sector in a certain area where there is no sharing of either assets or pool of profits. Each partner operates in its own independent capacity, no separate legal entity is created, and any limitations of liability, if at all, will be set out in the contract. Let us now go to specific examples of SPVs, municipal project companies, in Tanzania. Here we are talking about a modern market and a bus station. It comes in one project with an approximate cost of 10.1 million and with a financial leverage of 70%. Now, you may have noticed in one of the previous slides, I did not really dwell on that issue, that a typical feature of project finance is its high financial leverage. You will not be able to get that leverage if you are financing something against your balance sheet, because no bank will really give you, say, twice as much as your annual revenue is, because apparently this will raise issues about your ability to service the debt. So in project finance, you will be able to achieve quite a high leverage due to the expected financial flows from your project. And you can see at the bottom of the slide a typical scheme of project finance implementation, where you have a project company, a special purpose vehicle that is really in the center of the entire approach, and you have lenders who provide funding to the project company itself, as well as shareholders who provide equity to the same company. And then it is the project, through the project company, through the SPV, who is responsible for repaying the debt or repaying equity to the equity providers. This slide demonstrates a structure of a local government wholly owned SPV, special purpose vehicle. Of course, an SPV may be owned jointly by the public sector and the private sector. In fact, there may be more than one entity that establishes an SPV. There may be, for example, one municipality and two or three private entities. But there may also be cases, if it is legally allowed, when the public entity, a municipality in this case, establishes a wholly owned private company, an SPV. And this is a way to deal with the usual statutory limitations on the ability of local governments to borrow. In most cases, and this is also the case for many Latin American countries, the ability of local governments, municipalities in particular, to borrow is limited to 25% of their annual revenues, or 30% of their annual revenues. And in many cases, this also requires either sovereign guarantees, or it requires special permission from the Ministry of Finance. Now, a structure where an SPV is established by the municipality allows to deal in a more creative way. Of course, you still need for some assets to this new company, and you will still face the issue of getting agreement of either the Ministry of Finance or the central government. But once that company is established, it can then borrow against its own assets plus the expected revenues of the project. While project financing has a number of advantages, but as you can imagine, there are always two sides to the coin, so there are also some challenges. We've already mentioned the high financial leverage is one of the advantages. And indeed, for implementation of larger projects, project finance may be the only way to do it, because you will never be able to implement a capital-intensive project using only your own revenues, or say capital transfers coming from the central government. So creditworthiness of the project is independent of the promoter. You only need to prove that your project is creditworthy. You may not be creditworthy yourselves, which is, of course, a good thing. You don't need any collateral, because the future cash flows from the project serve as that collateral. And you also significantly reduce your commercial and financial risks. Why? Your risks are reduced because you transfer them to the lenders. And as you can imagine, the lenders would be quite reluctant to assume those risks unless they are really convinced about the quality and reliability of your project. And hence where the challenges come, because you need a lot of technical and financial development for any project to qualify for project finance. It requires a longer time for development and structuring. There are higher costs of project development. Furthermore, the financial sector in your country may lack expertise with the projects that are financed through project financing and may not be particularly responsive. And lastly, financial sector regulation may not be conducive to project financing. But here is also one added element, and this is this connects me to what Vito was talking about, tapping into capital markets. Project financing may be basis for floating a revenue bond issue. If you have a project, and the project, of course, has to be large enough for that purpose. If you have a project that produces cash flows as a result of its operation, then rather than going for a bank lending, you can go for a bond issue. And this is the connection between the various financial instruments that we can use for financing municipal infrastructure. Now, talking about various forms of partnerships, here is an example of a joint venture, which is the second less structured form of public-private partnership that we discussed before. And this is, again, a multi-purpose transportation park. And this is an interesting partnership where you have not only the public entity, which is represented by the municipal council, but you also have non-government entities, such as the church, which was one of the major contributors in kind into that project, and the private company. And you can see that what happened in this configuration is that the equity provided by the church and by the local government came in the form of land and road infrastructure. And most of the equity, 1.7 million, was contributed by the private partner, who was convinced about the viability of the project. And how it happened, and what really convinced the private partner about the viability was a rather lengthy process that took us about 3 years. And it started with the idea generation. It then moved into procurement of the project sponsor through consultations and a public tender based on a 50-year renewable land lease. And the land, as we just discussed, was the major equity, quasi-equity contribution into that project. Then a lengthy stage of project development followed, which included a number of studies, like a detailed feasibility study, including the traffic flow study in that location, because essentially the financial modeling of the project was based on the predictions of the traffic flow. This was the major justification for the revenues of the project. It went through a lengthy process of approvals, and we were surprised by ourselves how long it took. It went through the relevant ministry, then through the Solicitor General, and so on and so forth. And eventually, you know, the construction work started in August 2015, and the project is under implementation. Now, what are the lessons learned when we are talking about financing for municipal infrastructure? First of all, it is important that individual infrastructure projects are based in a systemic and cohesive approach. Usually that approach is part of your municipal development plan or some other development instrument that you have, and it is of course reflected in the capital investment plan that Vito mentioned shortly before. You need to be flexible about the transaction structures. We just discussed that the lack of regulatory frameworks or statutory limitations are not necessarily the key obstacles, and they might be dealt with if you display enough flexibility. Of course, the project structure should be the project financing structure should be adapted to the characteristics of the project. And if you have a project that is not revenue generating, of course, you cannot use the project financing modality. Flexibility in financial instruments is another important point. Vito has mentioned a number of various financial instruments. Of course, many of them require a well-developed capital market, which is not always there, plus the ability, both the legal ability and the financial ability of municipalities to participate in that market. But as we just discussed, there are ways around it. And the last point is that money is not a problem. I understand how you may feel. You may be sitting in your municipality, your revenues are low, the central government transfers are irregular and unpredictable, and if I tell you that money is not a problem, you probably would not believe me. I'm just coming from a two-day conference on municipal finance here in Geneva, and the point that financial institutions are hungry for bankable projects has been stressed again and again. And this is true. The money in principle, and Vito has mentioned in his presentation, like the amount of equity, which equals $100 trillion globally, or the amount of bonds, which is about the same amount. The money is in principle there, but because in many cases local governments and municipalities cannot develop their ideas to an extent where they become attractive to private investors, whether they are financial institutions or they are private companies, they cannot really tap into that capital that is out there, but it is out there. And if we take a concerted action and systematic efforts towards developing pipelines of investable projects, then tapping into that additional finance is not unrealistic. It is quite possible. So here are some suggested further readings, and many thanks to you for your attention.
Thank you very much. On behalf of the Ministry of Urban Development and Housing of Ecuador and the United Nations Institute for Training and Research, UNITAR, We would like to thank you for attending this webinar on municipal finance. And thank you, Dr. Poziraev and Dr. Intini, for giving this webinar. It has been very interesting. Now we are going to begin with a Q&A. Due to the time constraint, we are only going to do one question for each of the experts. So I have a question for Dr. Poziraev. What is the ideal way to finance the restoration of historic centers?
Well, first of all, we need to understand there is probably no ideal way, let me put it like this. But there is an approach to identifying the financial modalities that should be used. And the starting point is to decide whether it is a revenue-generating project or not. If it is a revenue-generating project, and I can imagine that the historic center can be a tourist attraction, and there can be revenue-generating possibilities in that project. If this is the case, you can then move into a partnership with the private sector. How structured and close that partnership might be, again, depends on the characteristics of the project itself. It depends on the interest of the private partners. It depends on your own experience of engagement with private partners, and I'm talking about both companies and financial institutions. In my opinion, getting private capital for restoration of the historic center is possible, but of course it will require some work to develop that project to an extent where it becomes bankable. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pozirev. Now I have a question for Dr. Intini. How can we strengthen the capacities of public officials?
Well, first of all, we need to assess the capacity of public officials because as I tried to show in my presentation, there are many aspects we need to consider in terms of the overall public financial management system that is characterized as specific local government. If it's a countrywide issue at the national level or in specific municipalities, trying to understand in terms of revenue collection where the weaknesses are. If it's the weaknesses between transfer from the central level to the local government level, or between within own source revenues, and I mentioned some of them and some of the potential indicators that we need to look into. Also, in terms of accounting practices, this is something that I try to emphasize a bit because there is a lot of room for improvement in this field. Again, using either cash-based or accrual-based accounting or double entering accounting. And asset management is a huge area that for sure has room for improvement in terms of a conducive policy framework, in terms of inventorying assets that are owned by the local government, in terms of proper valuation of those assets, in terms of transparent public reporting mechanism in place. Or again, a capital investment plan, as I mentioned before, there is a lot of room for improvement there, and also for implementation of that plan once it is done. And again, in terms of performance-based grants, a lot of performance-based grants need to be updated after 10 or 20 years. Sometimes it happens that those transfers are not updated based on the new reality on the ground in terms of demographic, economic reality, demand from the local population. So there are a number of areas that need to be really analyzed into in order to respond to this question. This includes land value capture, as I mentioned, as well, and also a conducive legal framework to tap into capital markets, be it a simple borrowing or a more sophisticated municipal bond issues. There is a continuum, as you can see, that start from basic requirements. Basic requirements include government transfers from the central to the local level, MPFM system in place, to enough capacity to build a capital investment plan that is reflective of the needs of the local government, and also moving to the net capacity of local government to tap into capital markets. So the whole that spectrum needs to be investigated, needs to be analyzed in depth, and that's why this is usually something that requires 1 or 2 years to do both a proper assessment, provide a sound policy advice, and start implementing some of this advice. The implementation itself will take way longer.
Thank you very much, Dr. Intini, and thank you everyone for attending this webinar. We just wanted to remind you that we have another set of webinars on July 26 and 27 on urban planning and environment, and we would invite you to register at our webpage, www.rumboahabitat3.ec, the same place where you registered, or at UNITAR's webpage. On July 26th, the webinar on environment and resilience in cities will be given at 11 a.m. Ecuador time by specialist Carolina Proaño. On July 27, the webinar on urban planning and disaster risk management will be given at 6 p.m. Ecuador time by specialists Dr. Graham Brewer, Mr. Sanjaya Bhatia, and Captain Steve O'Keefe. You can register at our webpage, as I just said, and thank you very much, and have a good morning or good evening, depending where you are at the world. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much, colleagues.
Hasta Quito en octubre.